Tonight we wander into the smoky warmth of a Viking longhouse, where firelight shivers against carved beams, and laughter rolls between benches heavy with roasted meat and foaming ale. Your senses tug at you, burnt fat pine resin and the faint woolly musk of cloaks drying by the hearth. Everyone is watching the bride and groom, two figures perched at the high seat as though they've suddenly been promoted from ordinary villagers to the royal family of this timber hall. You feel the weight of the feast, the clang of cups, the slosh of mead, and yet, in the back of your mind, there's an odd little secret forming. Beneath the soft layers of bedding prepared for the bridal night, beneath feathers and linsul, a spoon waits, hidden by the bride herself. You can't help but wonder why anyone would tuck a piece of cutlery into a pillow as if it were a precious treasure. A spoon of all things. You're not supposed to know yet, but that's exactly why you're here. Of course, you probably wouldn't survive long enough to reach the moment of discovery. Viking weddings could last 3 full days of feasting. Between the wrestling contests, the endless roasted sheep, and the occasional drunken uncle who decides to test his sword arm in the doorway, you'd be lucky to crawl to the bedding chamber with all your limbs still intact. Still, you slip into this world tonight, and you'll play along as though you belonged. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, leave a little note in the comments, your location and what time it is where you're listening. It always amazes me to see how far these sleepy Viking stories drift, from midnight in Oslo to dawn in Melbourne. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The feast sets the tone. For a Viking wedding, it wasn't enough simply to unite 2 people. You had to unite entire families, entire clans, sometimes entire villages. These unions stitched together fragile webs of loyalty, which meant that food and drink weren't just refreshments, they were declarations. Roasted oxen testified to wealth, honeyed mead announced prosperity, and even the plates and spoons on the table became part of the social theatre. Forks, you'll notice, were absent. They didn't enter European dining until much later. Knives were everywhere, but they were violent tools as much as eating instruments. The spoon, though, was soft-edged, communal, and practical. It passed broth, porridge, and beer-soaked stews from one generation to another, a quiet marker of continuity. When the bride finally rose from the feast, slipping away with her new husband towards the chamber set aside for them, she carried with her more than the weight of stairs. In her dowry chest she had laid out linens, perhaps a hand-woven wool blanket, and tucked into her pillow, a spoon. Was it silver? If her family were wealthy traders, maybe. Was it carved wood? More likely. Sometimes bone, sometimes bronze, but always personal. That little object hid inside soft feathers like a talisman, unseen by the guests still howling in the hall, but known to her. Historians still argue whether this ritual was superstition, practicality, or symbolism. Some suggest it meant she would never lack for food in her new home. Others argue it was a protective charm against hunger spirits or wandering trolls that might covet her fertility. And a few insist it might have been a subtle way to remind the groom's family. This bride comes with her own tools, her own dignity, her own claim to the household table. It's hard not to smile at the idea. Imagine sneaking a teaspoon into your hotel pillow today. Housekeeping would just assume you'd lost your midnight yogurt. But for her, the act was charged with meaning. In a world where winter could be cruel and famine was always one bad harvest away, hiding a spoon beneath your head was like whispering a promise to yourself. I will eat. I will endure. And so, as you linger in that chamber, watching her lean up and down to plump the pillow, you see her fingers brush the hidden curve of wood or silver. She exhales just a small sigh no one else notices and slips into bed beside her new husband. The hall roars outside, but the secret lies within the feathers, safe, soft, and strangely powerful. The longhouse fades into the quiet hum of a Viking farmstead, where the daily rhythm of life is shaped by timber walls, woolen cloaks, and the ever-present smell of smoke. You find yourself stepping across a floor scattered with rushes, the kind meant to catch the worst of spilled broth or ash. A dog curls in the corner, licking at the last bone of yesterday's stew, while geese shuffle impatiently just outside the doorway. This is the world in which spoons and pillows live side by side, not because someone dreamt of symbolic rituals alone, but because in these homes, the ordinary blended effortlessly with the sacred. Viking houses were compact yet layered. Imagine a single room, long and low, with the family sleeping along the benches that lined the walls. The centre hearth provided heat and light, though also a constant haze of smoke that reddened eyes and stained rafters. Pillows, if you could call them that, were stuffed with feathers, or sometimes straw, bound in linen covers woven by hand. They were precious in their own right, for feathers were not easy to gather in abundance, unless you had endless patience to pluck geese and ducks. So the bed was not merely a soft spot for sleep, it was a crafted, curated piece of household wealth. And where were the spoons in all this? Right there, often hanging from a peg by the hearth, or tucked in a chest alongside knives and small eating bowls. Every member of the household had their own spoon. A wooden spoon carved for a child, perhaps decorated with the simple swirl. A bone spoon kept for stews. A silver one if the family had ties to trade routes that stretched all the way to Byzantium. These were not disposable tools like the plastic forks you might toss today. They were personal, durable, and often carried sentimental value. Losing your spoon at a feast was a minor disaster. Borrowing someone else's spoon without permission, almost scandalous. It's in this domestic space that the idea of hiding a spoon inside a pillow begins to make sense. The pillow was not just a cushion for dreams, it was also a kind of safe. In a house without locks, without private drawers or jewellery boxes, hiding something inside your bedding gave it both secrecy and constant guardianship. After all, no one pawed through your pillow casually. And at night, when you rested your head, you quite literally guarded your little treasure with your own body. A spoon hidden there was both symbolic and practical, carrying its meaning right into sleep. Now here comes the quirky tidbit that makes you smile. Some sagas and folklore hint that spoons placed under pillows could help ward off nightmares. Think of it like the Viking version of a dream catcher, except sturdier, and occasionally useful if you woke up hungry for porridge. Whether brides believed in this dream-charming ability or not, it certainly adds a layer of magical thinking to what might otherwise seem like an odd bit of housekeeping. Historians still argue whether the practice belonged to a strictly bridal ritual, or if it was broader, tied to family customs. Was the spoon under the pillow only for brides, or did children sometimes do the same to feel safe at night? Archaeology gives us frustratingly few clues, since feathers rot, spoons get repurposed, and bedding almost never survives burial. What we know instead comes from scattered mentions, oral traditions, and the stubborn insistence of Scandinavian folklore collectors who, centuries later, noticed grandmothers whispering about spoons hidden in feathers. And so you picture it now, a dim Viking house, the smell of peat smoke drifting across the room, the muffled bleat of a goat outside. A bride bends low to fluff her pillow, pretending to adjust the linen, but really sliding her spoon deeper inside. It is her quiet rebellion against uncertainty, her whispered protection against hunger, her charm for a marriage she cannot predict. Her husband might never notice, and her mother-in-law certainly isn't supposed to, but the spoon waits, pressed beneath feathers, as faithful as any rune-etched amulet. You lie back beside her in imagination, your head heavy from the feast, and you feel the solid curve of that hidden utensil, like a promise tucked between the mundane and the mystical. And you realise that in a Viking home, nothing was ever just ordinary. Every object hummed with meaning, especially when kept so close to the heart. The longhouse grows quieter, and you turn your attention from the smoky rafters to the small details laid out across the benches and chests. Among them, spoons gleam in different shades: dull brown wood, polished bone, the occasional glimmer of silver catching the firelight. You begin to notice something peculiar. In a world where knives and axes seem to steal all the glory, spoons carried a surprising amount of symbolic weight. Think about it. A knife was everywhere. On belts, at feasts, on the battlefield. Its sharp edge spoke of violence and necessity. A spoon, by contrast, was softer, rounder, gentler. It was the thing you reached for when you wanted to nourish rather than wound. You could sip broth, scoop porridge, or cradle honey with it. A spoon was literally shaped for giving sustenance. No wonder brides stepping into uncertain futures clung to this rounded little symbol of care. Mainstream history reminds you that spoons were personal possessions, often kept for life. Excavations in Scandinavia have uncovered finely carved wooden spoons with simple runic inscriptions, as though the utensil wasn't just for eating, it was also a statement of identity. A girl might have her own spoon carved by her father or gifted by her mother, and it would travel with her into her new household after marriage. Tucking it into her pillow then wasn't merely a matter of superstition. It was bringing a piece of herself, her family, her heritage, into the bed where she now had to share her life. Here comes the quirky detail. In some accounts, spoons were carved in pairs like proto-wedding gifts, one spoon for the bride, one for the groom, sometimes bound together with twine until the wedding day. It's oddly touching, like a Viking version of his and hers towels. Except instead of pastel embroidery, you had runes for fertility, and maybe a decorative knotwork handle that could double as a weapon if you swung it hard enough. Historians still argue whether brides intentionally hid their spoons as secret charms or if the gesture was part of a broader household ritual, perhaps even encouraged by mothers or aunts. One theory insists that the spoon was more than symbolic. It could also serve as a backup utensil should the new bride find herself unwelcome at the feasting table. In a family where loyalties were fragile, where a bride was sometimes more hostage than guest, carrying your own spoon was like carrying your own key to survival. Hide it in your pillow, and you guaranteed you could eat, no matter who tried to freeze you out. Picture it. The hall is still loud with laughter, and the groom's family is still trading boasts over the roasted boar. But the bride, freshly bound into this unfamiliar household, has a spoon pressed beneath her head like a talisman. By day, it means she can eat. By night, it whispers of her link to her kin, her assurance that she hasn't been swallowed whole by this new family. It's a tiny rebellion disguised as simple housekeeping, invisible yet immensely powerful, and you can't help but chuckle. Today, losing your spoon means raiding the cutlery drawer and discovering that someone put them all in the dishwasher. In a Viking household, losing your spoon might mean the difference between sharing in the porridge or sitting hungry while others ate. The humble utensil carried the weight of dignity, survival, and identity, far more than forks and forks ever did. So when you imagine the bride smoothing her linen pillow and tucking that curved little object beneath the feathers, you can sense the duality, practical yet mystical, humble yet mighty. It wasn't just cutlery, it was her quiet statement, I belong here and I will endure. The hall has dimmed, though laughter still spills faintly from the feasting benches. You shift your gaze toward the heavy chest at the foot of the bridal bed. Inside it lies the dowry, the collection of goods the bride's family sent with her, not simply gifts but signals of her household value. Woven blankets, hand-dyed tunics, tools for spinning or weaving, sometimes even livestock. Each item whispered, "This woman comes prepared to run a household." And among these objects, utensils always mattered. A spoon might seem minor compared to a cow or a bolt of imported silk, but for Vikings, domestic expectations were enormous. Marriage wasn't about romance in the way your Netflix queue likes to imagine. It was about alliances, survival, and productivity. A bride was expected to transform wool into clothing, milk into butter, grain into bread. She was the centre of the household maintenance, and her dowry reflected that. The spoon, though humble, represented her readiness to feed others and herself. Now imagine her new position. She enters the longhouse not as a guest, but as a new resident, often surrounded by strangers. The groom's mother might watch her with hawk eyes, measuring whether this newcomer is worthy. By slipping her own spoon into her pillow, the bride asserted quiet independence. She wasn't entirely reliant on the groom's family's generosity. She had brought her own means of eating, her own symbol of provision. Mainstream records show us that Viking law codes sometimes listed dowry items in detail, including utensils. The Icelandic Gragas laws, for example, made provisions for household goods in disputes of inheritance or divorce. That's how seriously even the simplest tool could be regarded, worthy of legal mention. And yet, tucked away in the bedding, the spoon gained an extra layer of meaning beyond the law. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some later Scandinavian folk customs, a bride was expected to bring not one spoon, but an entire matched set of carved spoons for her new household. One story claims that if she failed to bring enough, her in-laws would mock her as a poor housekeeper, even if she had sheep and gold rings. In that light, a spoon wasn't just about eating, it was social proof. Like bringing your own toolkit to show you could fix the leaks in a marriage. Historians still argue whether the pillow hiding act was a widely recognised ritual, or more of a private superstition passed from mother to daughter. Was it a whispered bit of advice like, always keep a coin in your shoe for luck? Or was it a formal part of the marriage ceremony, unrecorded but deeply understood? The evidence doesn't give a neat answer. What remains clear is that dowries and domestic expectations made spoons far more significant than you might expect. So you picture her now, the bride kneeling beside her dowry chest, pulling out the linen pillowcase she wove herself, perhaps embroidered with simple red thread in looping patterns. She slips in the feathers, plumps them once, then adds her spoon, sliding it deep where no one can see. She ties the pillow shut and lays it carefully on the bed. Her dowry chest remains open, revealing its woven treasures, but the most intimate gift she gives herself tonight lies hidden beneath her head. You rest there too, noticing the scent of lanolin from the wool, the faint tang of iron from tools and keys stored in the chest, and the soft rasp of the linen. In this world where every item bore meaning, the spoon was more than an eating tool. It was an emblem of survival, domestic power, and quiet resistance against whatever future might unfold. The flicker of torches softens as you follow the couple away from the clamour of the feast. The bedding chamber is quiet compared to the hall, though quiet in a Viking household still means creaking timbers, muffled laughter from the doorway, and the restless shifting of animals just outside the walls. Here, the bed has been prepared, not with modern cotton sheets but with coarse linens, woolen blankets, and pillows stuffed with down feathers, each item signalling wealth and readiness for married life. And hidden in that softness, the bride's spoon lies waiting. On this first night of union, the symbolism of bedding stretched beyond comfort. In Viking belief, the bed was both sacred and practical. It was where new life began, where alliances were sealed, and where the continuity of family was ensured. Pillows plumped with feathers or wool weren't just places to rest your head. They were repositories of ritual. Brides were often instructed to bring charms or protective items into the bedding as if the marriage bed were a battlefield requiring invisible armour. Mainstream history tells us that amulets and charms were commonplace in Viking daily life. From Thor's hammer pendants to small rune-carved tokens, people constantly carried objects believed to shield them from ill fortune. The spoon beneath the pillow fell into that same category. It wasn't flashy like a hammer pendant or dramatic like an engraved sword, but it embodied nourishment and continuity, two forces equally important for survival. The quirky detail here is that some folklore suggests brides also tucked small herbs, like juniper or lovage, beneath their pillows to ensure fertility or ward off mischievous spirits. Pairing a spoon with herbs turned the pillow into a portable altar of protection and prosperity. It's a far cry from your modern decorative throw pillows, which seem to multiply on sofas until you're not sure if they're for sitting or for building a fort. Historians still argue whether the spoon was primarily for practical assurance, you'll always have food, or for spiritual protection, keeping evil spirits or jealous relatives from interfering in the marriage bed. Some theories even suggest it was part of a larger fertility charm, linking the spoon's rounded, womb-like shape with hopes for children. Like many Viking traditions, the line between superstition and practicality blurred so thoroughly that you can't always tell where one ended and the other began. So you imagine it. The bride lowers herself onto the bedding, her hand brushing the pillow where the spoon rests. She knows it is there, though her new husband may not. Perhaps her mother whispered the instruction earlier in the day, or perhaps it was her own decision, a secret ritual carried out with nervous fingers. Outside, the feasting continues, the hall echoing with songs of Thor and Freyja, but inside this chamber, she clings to her own safeguard. The air is heavy with the scent of wool, mead still lingering on her breath, and the low glow of firelight pressing shadows across the wooden walls. She exhales, comforted not only by the man beside her, but by the solid presence of that spoon, a talisman of nourishment, protection, and continuity tucked safely beneath her head. And in that fragile moment between feast and future, she finds just enough courage to drift towards sleep. The pillow shifts slightly under her head, and you sense the curve of the spoon pressing back against the feathers. Tonight it might be a simple wooden utensil, smooth from years of use, or perhaps a newly carved one, its surface still smelling faintly of resin, with a handle decorated in interlacing knotwork. Yet not every bride had the same kind of spoon. Just as Viking households ranged from modest sheep farms to wealthy trading families, so too did their spoons reveal a spectrum of materials and meanings. Wooden spoons were the most common, carved from birch or ash, sturdy and reliable. These were everyday tools, but even the plainest could be personalised with whittled patterns or runes. Some mothers etched protective marks into the handle, ensuring their daughters carried not just a spoon but a charm. Bone spoons, crafted from cattle or even whale, carried a different weight. They were tougher, whiter, and often used for stews thick enough to dull a wooden bowl. Then there were bronze spoons, sometimes with intricate handles, and the rare silver ones, gleaming tokens that spoke of trade connections stretching to the British Isles, or even Byzantium if you really wanted to impress the neighbours. Mainstream history tells us that silver spoons were prestige items among Viking elites. Archaeologists have uncovered them in high-status graves, sometimes alongside brooches and imported glassware. To place such a spoon beneath your pillow was more than superstition. It was wealth tucked into feathers, a promise that you entered marriage with dignity and status intact. Here's a quirky tidbit to make you smirk. Some spoons were deliberately made too large, comically oversized compared to ordinary ones. Scholars speculate they may have been ceremonial, used in feasts where excess itself was the message. Imagine tucking one of those under your pillow, rolling over in the night and nearly poking your ear. Not the most comfortable charm, but certainly memorable. Historians still argue whether the material of the spoon mattered symbolically. Did a wooden spoon represent humility and hard work, while a silver one promised prosperity? Or was it simply about what you had available in your dowry chest? The debate continues, with some pointing out that a wooden spoon might have carried more emotional weight if it was carved by a beloved parent or older sibling compared to an impersonal silver piece purchased from a trader. Picture it again. The bride's head rests lightly, and beneath her the spoon lies secure. If it is wooden, it is warm with memory, etched by hands she trusts. If it is bone, it speaks of endurance, the raw toughness of an animal sacrificed for the household. If it is silver, it gleams in the shadows, quietly declaring her family's reach in the world of trade. Each type of spoon tells its own story, yet all share the same hidden role, guarding her as she drifts into uncertain dreams. You smile at the thought of your own pillow stash, maybe a spare phone charger or an emergency chocolate bar. The Viking bride's spoon was no less practical, but infinitely more symbolic. And as the hall outside hums with drunken songs, she sleeps a little easier, knowing that beneath the softness of feathers lies something solid, something hers, something that will not vanish with the morning light. The feast outside still echoes faintly, cups clanging, a half-drunk uncle belting out a saga that no one asked for. But here, in the dim glow of the bedding chamber, you realise the spoon isn't just about the pillow. It carries with it the whole world of Viking feasting, that noisy ritual where families sealed alliances and measured each other's worth. What happened at the high table always rippled into the bedchamber, because in Viking culture food and marriage were inextricably linked. Imagine the hall earlier that day. The central fire blazed while benches groaned under trenchers of roasted pork, bowls of fish stew, and thick loaves of bread. Horns of mead were passed hand to hand, and the bride, though silent, watched every exchange. Eating together was more than nourishment. It was politics in edible form. When two families merged through marriage, the feast was their stage to prove abundance, generosity, and strength. A poorly stocked table could ruin reputations faster than a sword fight. Mainstream history reminds you that Viking feasts often lasted several days, with strict seating hierarchies. Guests watched who was given what, who was invited to drink from the same horn, and who had to scrape stew from the bottom of the pot. The spoon, then, was the quiet participant in all of this, the tool that bridged feast and person. To carry one into bed, hidden in a pillow, was to carry the memory of the feast's abundance into the private space of marriage. Here's your quirky tidbit. Saga fragments tell of rowdy feasts where men used spoons not just for stew but as makeshift instruments, tapping them against cups or even hurling them across the table in mock battles. Imagine dodging a flying spoon during the middle of a toast. No wonder brides may have chosen to hide their own utensils somewhere safe, like under their pillow, far away from the chaos of the hall. Historians still argue whether the feasting to bedding connection was conscious symbolism or simply practical overlap. Did brides tuck spoons beneath pillows because the feasts reminded them of the fragility of food security? Or was it a ritualized act, part of carrying the spirit of the feast into the marital bed? Some scholars see echoes of fertility symbolism here. The rounded spoon linking to the womb, the feasting linking to abundance, both converging under the soft feathers of the bridal pillow. So you linger in the chamber, listening to the muffled laughter through the timber walls, and picture her spoon tucked safely inside the pillow, humming with echoes of the feast. While others boast and bellow outside, she holds her own quiet banquet, one that exists not on the table, but in the certainty that she carries nourishment into her new life. You too almost feel it. The warmth of broth still on your lips, the heaviness of bread in your stomach, and the secret security of that spoon pressing gently against your dreams. The laughter fades further into the night, leaving only the steady hiss of the hearth fire and the rustle of straw beneath woolen blankets. You breathe in the air, smoky, warm, tinged with the sweetness of ale, and sense the weight of fear that haunted Viking homes more than the noise of feasts ever could. Famine, one bad harvest, one long winter, and the entire household could find themselves trading gold for grain, or worse, going hungry. It is in this shadow that the spoon in the pillow shines brightest, carrying not just the memory of abundance, but the hope of abundance yet to come. For Vikings, food security was never guaranteed. Mainstream history reminds us that their diet depended heavily on grain imports from more temperate lands, and poor weather could wreck crops in Scandinavia for months. Dried fish and stored butter were staples, but even these could spoil. To tuck a spoon beneath your pillow was more than superstition, it was a whisper of reassurance. The spoon became a charm against famine, a promise that nourishment would always find its way to your lips. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some Icelandic folktales claim that a spoon under the pillow could help you dream of fertile fields, or even show you in your sleep where lost livestock had wandered. Imagine relying on a cutlery-fueled dream to recover a missing cow. Practical? Maybe not. Comforting? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether brides believed the spoon offered literal protection against hunger, or if it was purely symbolic. Was it a survival tactic, bring your own utensils so you'll never be excluded from meals, or a mystical act of aligning yourself with prosperity? The debate remains unsolved, though both interpretations speak to the same deep anxiety, the fear of scarcity. Picture the bride shifting in her bed. She presses her cheek against the pillow, and beneath it lies her spoon, warm from her body's heat. To her, it is as if she cradles a promise of meals yet to come. Bowls of stew, thick with barley, bread baked from freshly ground rye, butter churned from spring milk. Each imagined taste reassures her that her new household will thrive, that hunger will not stalk her children, that the shadows of famine will not invade her dreams. You smile at the contrast. Today, the idea of hiding a spoon in your pillow to avoid hunger sounds like something you'd read in a wellness blog sandwiched between 10 ways to boost your energy and why kale will save civilization. But for her, in a fragile world perched on the edge of scarcity, the spoon wasn't quirk. It was survival dressed in ritual. As you drift with her into sleep, you feel the spoon's rounded edge pressing faintly beneath feathers, carrying with it the weight of hope. May the bowls always be full, may the harvest never fail, may the family never starve. The fire burns low, shadows pooling in the corners of the chamber, and you sense the deeper layer of meaning tucked beneath that pillow. The spoon doesn't just guard against a hunger, it whispers of something far more intimate, fertility. For a Viking bride, the first nights of marriage were heavy with expectation. The household looked to her not just for bread and butter, but for children to inherit land, keep the farm alive, and carry the family name through stormy winters. In that sense, the spoon's rounded bowl became a symbol of womb and plenty, a subtle reminder that abundance meant not only full bellies, but also full cradles. Mainstream history records that fertility rituals were woven into many Viking marriage practices. Couples were sometimes blessed with Thor's hammer, symbol of strength and virility, or given sprigs of evergreen as signs of enduring life. Beds themselves were considered sacred spaces, closely tied to the goddess Freya, patroness of love and fertility. To slip a spoon into the pillow was a small secret addition to this web of omens, one the bride could control, carried out without spectacle or ceremony. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some fragments of Scandinavian folklore suggest that women who wished for many children would feed their pillow by hiding a spoon, as though the bedding itself were a guest at the feast of life. The idea of plumping a pillow with both feathers and utensils might make you laugh, but in a symbolic framework where everything spoke of fertility, it made a curious sort of sense. Historians still argue whether this spoon ritual was explicitly about fertility, or more generally about prosperity. Did brides truly believe the shape of the spoon carried womb-like power? Or was it later folklore trying to explain a practice whose original meaning had already been forgotten? The debate leaves plenty of room for speculation, which is probably why the story of the pillow spoon endures so stubbornly. So you imagine her again, curling beneath the blanket, her hand brushing her stomach as her head sinks into the pillow. The spoon beneath her cheek feels like a quiet promise, not of food alone, but of children to feed in the years ahead. She exhales into the hush, her breath mingling with the faint scent of feathers, the smoky tang of the longhouse air, and the future that presses invisibly all around her. Outside, the world still feasts. Inside, she cradles her hopes for abundance, fertility, and continuity, all in the hidden weight of a simple spoon. The embers glow faintly, and in that quiet, your thoughts turn to the darker side of Viking imagination, the unseen beings who crept through thresholds, fields, and even bedding. If hunger haunted their days, then trolls, draugr, and jealous spirits haunted their nights. The Vikings lived in a world where the veil between ordinary life and the supernatural was thin, and every household object doubled as a potential charm against it. That spoon in the pillow? It wasn't just about food or fertility, it was also a weapon against what might come creeping in the dark. Mainstream history reminds us that Vikings often placed protective amulets around their homes. Thor's hammers carved in wood above doorways, iron knives hidden in rafters, or special herbs scattered across thresholds. These weren't decorations, but defences against beings that could sour milk, wither crops, or cause a bride to miscarry. In that world, slipping a spoon into your pillow was a discreet form of armour. The round reflective surface of a polished spoon might even have been thought to confuse spirits, much as mirrors later were used in European folklore to ward off witches. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some Scandinavian folktales, trolls were said to hate the clatter of metal spoons, as though the sound alone was enough to chase them away. It's oddly comforting to imagine a bride lying on her pillow, secure in the knowledge that her hidden spoon might rattle just enough if disturbed, keeping away any unwanted midnight visitors, supernatural or otherwise. Historians still argue whether this was genuine spiritual defense or a retroactive interpretation of a more practical act. Did brides hide spoons as a conscious form of magical protection, or did later storytellers weave that meaning onto the practice when its origins were forgotten? The evidence is thin, but the persistence of the belief suggests people found reassurance in thinking the spoon was more than metal or wood. It was a shield. So you see her lying there, not merely protecting herself from hunger, but from envy. Because weddings weren't always joyous for everyone. A jilted suitor, an unfriendly cousin, even a rival family could cast a sour glance at the union. In a culture that believed envy carried real spiritual danger, the dreaded evil eye, that spoon became a private bulwark. Hidden, secret and resting beneath her head, it formed the simplest of charms against forces she couldn't control. And you realise, drifting with her into that half sleep, that sometimes the smallest object, round, ordinary, almost affably humble, could bear the heaviest load of protection. While her husband dreamed beside her, she was kept safe by a spoon, pressed close as breath, shielding her from trolls, jealousy, and fate itself. The chamber sinks into deeper stillness, and you realise that the hidden spoon was never confined to feathers and linen alone. It echoed outward into songs and stories carried on the tongues of skalds and woven through the sagas. The Vikings loved to cloak meaning in riddles and verses, and while spoons rarely starred as heroes, they slipped into the margins like secret symbols, half whispered and half joked about. Mainstream history reminds you that saga literature often preserved not only the grand exploits of warriors, but also the daily quirks of life. Who carved what, who hoarded what, and who failed to keep their household running smoothly. Though few lines mention spoons directly, domestic imagery, feasts, bowls, and the implements of eating was a constant shorthand for prosperity. To say that a man's bowl was always full was to say his household thrived. To note that his spoon was missing was to hint at disorder or want. In that sense, a spoon tucked in a pillow fits perfectly within the symbolic vocabulary of the sagas. Here's your quirky tidbit. Riddles preserved in Icelandic manuscripts sometimes used utensils as metaphorical stand-ins for human behaviour. One fragment even likens a spoon to a faithful servant, always dipping and carrying but never biting. Picture that being recited in a smoky hall, the crowd chuckling at the sly comparison, while a bride nearby thinks of her own spoon hidden in her pillow. Historians still argue whether sagas and songs directly reflected everyday customs, or if they stylized them for storytelling flair. Did Viking poets deliberately allude to hidden charms like the pillow spoon? Or are we retrofitting meaning onto poetic lines that simply enjoyed household imagery? The debate hums quietly among scholars, like the drone of a lyre in a hall corner, unresolved but intriguing. So you lean back into the scene. A skald at the feast recites verses about abundance and loyalty, the hall claps in rhythm, and the bride listens while fingering the pillow later that night. She hears the spoon's echo in the words, even if no one else does. The object beneath her head becomes part of an oral tradition, a silent verse only she carries into dreams. And as you picture her drifting off, you realise the spoon isn't just hidden in feathers, it's hidden in stories, in whispers, in lines half sung by poets who knew the power of ordinary things. Tonight the sagas don't end in bloodshed or raids, they end in a full, round spoon, sleeping beneath a pillow carrying its own quiet verse. The longhouse feels like it breathes with you, smoke curling from the hearth, a faint draught sighing through the wooden beams, and you notice how belief itself shifted within these walls. By the later Viking Age, Christianity was pressing into Scandinavia, mingling with the older Norse faith like two rivers colliding. That spoon tucked into the pillow wasn't immune to the change. It carried layers of meaning that blurred between pagan charm and Christian token. Mainstream history reminds us that the conversion of Scandinavia happened not overnight, but over centuries. In some households you could find a Thor's hammer pendant hanging beside a cross, the family hedging their bets between old gods and new saints. In that environment, a spoon might take on new symbolism. To pagan minds, it still stood for fertility, nourishment, and protection. To Christian interpreters, it might have echoed the Eucharist, the spoon as a vessel for holy nourishment, or even a discreet nod toward divine provision. Here's your quirky tidbit. Later Scandinavian folk practices sometimes encouraged brides to hide small crosses or saints' medals in their pillows, almost exactly as their pagan foremothers had done with spoons. It's as if the tradition shifted costumes but kept the same stage direction. Place something small, protective and nourishing beneath your head, and you'll be guarded through the night. Historians still argue whether the pillow spoon custom predates Christianity entirely, or if it was reinterpreted once new beliefs arrived. Did pagan brides invent it as a fertility charm, only for Christian brides to baptize the habit with new meaning? Or did the act exist in both contexts simultaneously, a hybrid ritual straddling two faiths. The sources refuse to settle the question, leaving the spoon suspended in a kind of symbolic twilight. So you imagine her now, the Viking bride lying down in her bed during this age of transition. She may have whispered a prayer to Freyja earlier in the day, invoking the goddess's blessing for fertility. And then, perhaps, as she laid her head to rest, she also murmured a Christian prayer she had overheard from a missionary or priest. The spoon beneath her pillow absorbed both meanings. Pagan charm and Christian safeguard nestled together like two voices harmonizing. And you, drifting beside her, realize how human the act really is. In times of change, people don't discard old symbols, they layer new ones on top, till a spoon in a pillow carries both the old god's promise of abundance and the new god's assurance of daily bread. What remains constant is the human need for comfort in the dark, to fall asleep believing the future is held somehow in the palm of your hand, or in the curve of a hidden spoon. The fire has dwindled to coals, faintly glowing beneath the haze of smoke, and you realize that the spoon-in-pillow habit wasn't uniform across the whole Viking world. Scandinavia was no single block of culture. It sprawled across fjords, islands, and inland valleys, each with its own flavour of tradition. What a bride did in Iceland might not look quite the same as what a bride in Denmark or on a Norwegian fjord whispered into her pillow feathers. Mainstream history shows us how regional variations marked Viking daily life. Iceland, for example, had fewer resources, timber was scarce, and imported goods became precious symbols of status. A silver spoon under a pillow there would scream elf in a way it might not in coastal Denmark, where trade was brisker. In Greenland, where survival itself was a daily negotiation with ice and wind, a spoon of carved bone tucked into bedding may have been less about fertility and more about the blunt assurance that we will endure another winter. Here's a quirky tidbit. Folklore from the Faroe Islands tells of brides who hid not spoons, but small sheep bones in their pillows, a token of their family's flocks. The sheep's bone wasn't just a charm for food, but a promise of wool, milk, and lambs. In other words, different regions substituted different tokens, but the logic was the same. Hide a symbol of sustenance under your head to guard your new household. Historians still argue whether these regional quirks were truly Viking in origin, or later folk evolutions layered onto the memory of Viking customs. Were pillow charms pan-Scandinavian, or were they pockets of practice that varied wildly from one settlement to another? Some scholars argue that what we call the Viking spoon may have been just one visible example of a broader Northern European tendency to tuck charms into bearding, each region adapting the symbol to its resources. So you picture it now as if you're travelling across the seas. In Norway, a bride slides a polished wooden spoon into her pillow. In Denmark, it might be a gleaming piece of silver from a bustling market. In Iceland, perhaps a simpler, bone-carved tool worn smooth from daily use. Each bride lies down in the dark, her head cradled, not just by feathers, but by the weight of her homeland, her family's resources, her region's traditions. And you, drifting with them across fjords and islands, realize how this single act radiates into a kaleidoscope of customs. A spoon in a pillow is never just a spoon. It is geography, economy, belief and hope, pressed beneath linen, whispering through the feathers. The coals have burned down to a faint red thread, and your thoughts wander not to the living, but to the traces they left behind. If you wanted to prove that brides truly tucked spoons into pillows, where would you look? Not in sagas, not in folklore alone, but in the earth itself, in graves, in ruins, in the quiet testimony of archaeology. Mainstream history tells us that Viking graves often included personal utensils. Excavations in Birka, Sweden, for instance, Uncovered wooden and bone spoons laid alongside combs, keys and weaving tools. These weren't luxury trinkets. They were practical items, symbols of the everyday life the deceased would need in the afterworld. Some graves even contained spoons tucked near the head of the body, nestled among deteriorated textiles. Whether by accident or intention, the positioning makes you wonder, were they meant to mirror the pillow tradition? Or had bedding simply collapsed over centuries, leaving spoons where pillows once lay? Here's a quirky tidbit. One grave in Denmark revealed a woman buried with both a spoon and a small iron key, positioned close together. Folklorists like to point out that in later Scandinavian tales, keys represented authority over the household, while spoons represented its nourishment. Imagine being buried with both. Here lies the housekeeper supreme. She locked the chest and filled the bowls. It's a kind of domestic superhero kit, hidden in the soil for 1,000 years. Historians still argue whether such finds are evidence of actual pillow rituals or simply grave goods that shifted over time. Bedding rarely survives in the damp earth, and spoons themselves rot unless made of metal. Some insist that the tradition of hiding spoons in pillows is supported by these finds. Others caution that we may be romanticising, projecting folklore backward into archaeology. The argument, like so many in Viking studies, ends with a shrug and a hopeful grin, but still you imagine it. An archaeologist brushing dirt from a faint silver glint, pulling a spoon from the soil where a head once rested. The air is cold, the trench is quiet, but in that moment the researcher feels the same uncanny curiosity you do tonight. Was this utensil once pressed under a pillow guarding a bride in her first uncertain nights? Or was it simply a favourite tool buried close to her so she'd never be without it? And you drift in that thought, realising how the earth itself guards these secrets. What brides once whispered into feathers, the ground now whispers back to us in spoons cradled by silence waiting to be noticed 1,000 years later. The longhouse fades around you, and now your focus sharpens on the spoon itself, not as a utensil or a charm, but as a token of identity. In Viking culture, personal items often carried carvings, marks, or runes that made them more than just tools. A spoon might be plain at first glance, but turn it over in your hand and you would often find grooves, knotwork, or even a single rune etched into its handle. These weren't decorative flourishes alone, they were declarations of who the object belonged to and what it meant. Mainstream history offers plenty of parallels. Combs with runic inscriptions, weaving tablets marked with initials, even weapons etched with ownership marks. Why not spoons too? A carved rune for prosperity or fertility could transform a simple eating tool into a small talisman. Some scholars point to finds where utensils bore designs clearly intended for more than function. They were markers of identity, passed down or given as gifts. For a bride, slipping such a spoon into her pillow was like whispering her name into her new bed. I am here, and this is mine. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some later Scandinavian folk traditions, lovers gifted spoons carved with interlocking hearts or twin animals, tokens meant to be tucked away until marriage. Imagine that, receiving a spoon instead of a ring. It sounds ridiculous until you remember that the spoon symbolized nourishment and continuity. A ring promises eternity, but a spoon promises dinner. And which one really gets you through winter? Historians still argue whether spoons with carvings were meant primarily as love tokens or simply as practical markers of ownership. Was the rune on a spoon a declaration of affection, or just a way of saying, hands off, this one's mine? Either way, the intimacy of hiding such a spoon under a pillow suggests the bride knew its meaning went deeper than mere utility. Picture her hand brushing the carved handle before tucking it beneath feathers. Maybe the rune catches a flicker of lamplight, Maybe the knotwork was carved by her father, or by the groom himself. In that moment, the spoon is not just a charm, it is a biography in miniature, compressed into wood or bone. Every notch tells a story of who she was, who she hoped to be, and who she trusted. And so, as she lies down, she doesn't just rest her head on linen. She rests her identity, hidden yet secure, carried forward into the strange new household that awaits her. The spoon says what she cannot yet say aloud: I am still myself, even here. The air in the chamber grows still, and you can almost hear the quiet murmurs of scholars arguing across centuries about what that spoon under the pillow really meant. Some shake their heads and call it a superstition, others insist it was practical, and still others lean back smugly and claim it was a symbolic gesture that folded all meanings together. You realise the mystery survives precisely because the evidence is so thin. Just enough whispers from folklore and finds from graves to spark debate, but never enough to settle it. Mainstream history anchors us in what is certain. Spoons were vital in Viking households, personal, often carved and sometimes buried with their owners. Pillows were stuffed with feathers or straw and valued as rare comforts. That much we know. Everything else, the hidden spoon as fertility charm, as famine safeguard, as ward against trolls, remains conjecture. And historians, being human, love conjecture as much as certainty. Here's your quirky tidbit. In the 9th century, a folklorist recorded a Scandinavian grandmother who insisted that a bride without a spoon in her pillow will never keep her husband's love. Was she preserving an ancient memory, or inventing her own bedtime proverb to keep nosy scholars entertained? Either way, the quote continues to pop up in academic footnotes like an echo of the past refusing to vanish. Historians still argue whether the practice was widespread across the Viking world or only existed in scattered families. Was it a common expectation like wearing a white dress today? Or was it a private family custom that gained notoriety later through gossip? Without written records, we're left guessing, squinting at sagas, and stitching meaning into gaps the way Viking women stitched bright embroidery into dull wool. So you picture the scene not only through the smoky hall, but through the crowded conference room of modern scholars. One insists the spoon was a charm for fertility, another waves an excavation photo. A third cracks a joke about over-analysing cutlery. The arguments blur, the conclusions waver, and you realise that the uncertainty itself is part of the magic. The spoon remains hidden, not only in pillows but in history, a secret that refuses to fully surface. And as you sink into the bedding with the bride once more, you smile at the thought. Maybe she would laugh too, to know that 1,000 years later professors are still losing sleep over the spoon she once tucked quietly beneath her head. The chamber feels hushed now, as though time itself has softened around the edges, and you realise the spoon in pillow ritual wasn't an isolated oddity. Other cultures, far from the fjords, practice similar habits, tucking charms, tools, or small objects beneath bedding, as if sleep required guardians. By comparing them, the Viking bride's secret act feels less like an eccentric quirk and more like part of a larger human pattern. Mainstream history points to Celtic traditions where brides sometimes hid small tokens of fertility, nuts, grains, or carved charms in their bedding on the wedding night. Among Slavic peoples, customs involved slipping bread crusts or tiny iron tools beneath pillows, meant to ensure both sustenance and protection. Anglo-Saxon households also prized the symbolism of eating utensils. In some cases, a bride's dowry listed them explicitly, echoing the Viking emphasis on practical nourishment as spiritual security. Here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval German folklore tells of brides placing pretzels beneath pillows for luck in fertility. Imagine lying on that crunch, twist, salt. The spoon suddenly seems like the more comfortable choice. Historians still argue whether these parallels prove cultural borrowing or just the universality of human anxieties. Did Vikings adopt the habit from neighbouring tribes? Or did everyone independently discover that hiding something nourishing under your head helped you sleep better? Some argue trade routes spread not only goods but customs, along with spoons, combs and charms. Others counter that all societies staring into the abyss of famine and uncertainty arrive at similar symbolic acts. So you wander with your imagination across these landscapes, a Celtic bride pressing hazelnuts into feathers, a Slavic bride tucking bread beneath her head, a German bride awkwardly cradling a pretzel, and the Viking bride with her carved spoon. Different foods, different tokens, yet the same message repeats across the map. May this marriage be full. May this household never know want. May life itself be nourished. And you, drifting across these cultures like a ghostly guest, realize that the Viking spoon belongs to a chorus of traditions. It wasn't just Hörsrul. It was humanity's way of easing into uncertain nights with something solid, edible, or symbolic pressed close to the dreamer's cheek. The embers collapse into faint grey ash, and the longhouse around you seems to dissolve into centuries of memory. The spoon in the pillow does not vanish with the end of the Viking Age. Instead, it lingers, carried quietly into the folk traditions of later Scandinavia. What began as a bride's secret comfort became a half-forgotten whisper, still present in households long after ships stopped raiding foreign coasts. Mainstream history tells us that Scandinavian folklore is full of echoes of Viking belief, softened and reshaped but stubbornly persistent. Farmers still muttered charms against trolls, fishermen still carried tokens for luck, and brides still slipped small objects into bedding for protection or prosperity. Even into the 18th and 19th centuries, rural households in Norway and Sweden kept the idea that a spoon represented nourishment and stability. Grandmothers told new brides to keep their own spoon close, not for eating anymore but for luck in marriage. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some areas of rural Sweden, children were told that placing a spoon under the pillow would ensure they dreamed of the person that they were meant to marry. Imagine going to bed as a teenager, spoon hidden under your pillow, hoping to wake up with dream visions of your future spouse, though hopefully not while drooling directly on the utensil. Historians still argue whether this folk practice directly descended from Viking customs or whether it was reinvented later, with people simply gravitating to spoons as natural symbols of nourishment. Was there a continuous thread stretching back to the bridal chambers of the 10th century, or do we only see resemblance because we want to? The debate remains open, but the persistence of the motif, a spoon hidden beneath the feathers, suggests that memory carried further than we think. So you picture a farmhouse centuries after the Viking Age, its walls painted white, its hearth smaller, but the bed still stuffed with straw and feathers. A bride adjusts her pillow, her fingers brushing the hidden curve of a spoon, unaware that her Viking foremothers did the same 1,000 years before. The practice has lost its sharp edges of pagan fertility and troll defence, yet the shape remains, softened into simple folk wisdom. Keep a spoon near and you will not want for love or bread. And in that continuity, you realise the power of the ritual was never about one age or one faith. It was about the human desire to feel safe as you close your eyes, to cradle a token of survival in the tender space between waking and dreams. The chamber is hushed, the coals nearly cold, and you find yourself wondering why the pillow, of all places, became the chosen vault for this secret spoon. After all, a chest could hide it more securely, or a pouch at the bride's belt would keep it closer during the day. But in Viking households, the pillow wasn't just bedding, it was a liminal space, soft enough to cradle the body, yet symbolic enough to cradle a life's fortune. Mainstream history reminds us that bedding in the Viking Age was rare and valuable. Pillows were not everyday luxuries but hand-stitched treasures, filled with feathers painstakingly plucked. They were often passed down as heirlooms, layered with embroidered covers. To slip something into your pillow was to place it in one of the most personal and guarded spaces of the home. No one rifled through another person's pillow lightly. In that sense, the pillow was the closest thing to a private safe a Viking woman could claim. Here's your quirky tidbit. Later Scandinavian folklore sometimes advised placing knives or scissors under pillows to ward off nightmares or mischievous elves. Imagine rolling over in your sleep and finding a blade instead of feathers. Not exactly cozy. Against that backdrop, the spoon seems like the gentlest of all protective charms, far less risky for your ears. Historians still argue whether the choice of the pillow had symbolic resonance beyond practicality. Some suggest the pillow represented the bride's dreams, making it the perfect place for fertility charms. Others argue that hiding a spoon under one's head emphasized the unity of body and sustenance, the mind resting on the promise of nourishment. A few even point out the symbolic layering of sleep and death. The pillow as a rehearsal for the grave, the spoon a companion for both worlds. So you see her now, adjusting the soft down beneath her cheek, tucking the spoon deeper into its feathery hiding place. She could have placed it in a chest or worn it at her belt, but instead she chose the pillow, because the pillow was where no one else looked, where dreams and symbols mingled, where the body itself became guardian of the charm. And you realize as you drift beside her that pillows have always been strange little vaults for secrets. Even now you may have tucked away coins, notes, or forgotten trinkets under your own. Across 1,000 years that logic persists. The pillow is where you hide the things that matter most, close to your head, close to your dreams, safe in the soft boundary between waking and sleep. The long night wanes, the first pale light of dawn edging across the wooden shutters, and you sense the weight of the spoon story reaching its quiet conclusion. From the noisy hall of feasts to the hushed bed of the bride, from grave finds to folk whispers, the hidden spoon has carried us through layers of meaning. And still the truth remains elusive. Did Viking brides hide spoons in pillows for fertility, for protection, for food security, or simply because their mothers told them to? The answer drifts just out of reach, as soft and uncertain as feathers beneath linen. Mainstream history reminds us that Viking culture was filled with symbolic acts that blurred practicality with belief. A key at the bride's belt meant she was mistress of the household. A hammer charm around her neck linked her to Thor's protection. A spoon in her pillow may have been another thread in this tapestry, weaving the domestic into the sacred. It was never just a utensil, it was a promise, a safeguard, a reminder that she carried her past into her new future. Here's your quirky tidbit. Scandinavian collectors in the 19th century stumbled on families who still kept bride spoons wrapped away in linen chests, never used but never discarded. Some were said to bring luck to any girl who slept with one under her pillow before marriage. Imagine inheriting grandma's spoon and being told, "Now don't eat your stew with it, just tuck it in your bedding." A domestic heirloom turned secret talisman. Historians still argue whether the spoon custom truly began with Vikings or whether later folklore projected the idea backward. But perhaps that's the point. The spoon's magic is its mystery, its refusal to settle neatly into one explanation. It lingers in possibilities, a charm against trolls, a promise of food, a symbol of fertility, a piece of personal identity hidden where only the bride would know. So you watch her, the Viking bride finally stirring with dawn. The hall outside is quiet at last. The revellers collapsed in drunken heaps. She rises, smoothing her linen gown, and for a brief moment she touches the pillow. aware of the hidden weight inside. She smiles softly, as though reassured by its presence, and then turns toward the day ahead. And you, drifting at her side, realize the lasting legacy of that quiet act. The smallest object hidden in the gentlest of places can carry the heaviest of hopes. A spoon in a pillow and 1,000 years of questions. Now the story softens, the flames fading to whispers of smoke, the voices of feast dissolving into the hush of dawn. You are no longer in a Viking hall or a bridal chamber, but in your own quiet space where pillows wait, familiar and safe. The journey you've taken through feasts and fears, through spoons carved from wood or bone, through the mysteries of fertility and famine, begins to fold in on itself like a blanket being drawn close. Notice how the images settle gently in your mind. A bride smoothing her pillow, the soft weight of feathers, the hidden curve of a spoon. Nothing loud, nothing sharp, only soft edges and simple reassurances. These images invite you to rest, to let go of the noisy feasts and the debates of scholars, and to settle into the certainty that even the smallest object can carry comfort. Let your breath slow now, matching the rhythm of a fire's last embers. Inhale the calm, exhale the day. You may picture the bride still resting, her secret safe, her future unwritten, yet her heart eased by the hidden charm beneath her head. In that simple act lies a reminder for you too, that comfort often comes not from grand gestures, but from tiny quiet tokens that stay close through the night. As the final light of the Viking dawn filters into the chamber, so too does a gentler light settle over you. The story has been told, the questions linger, but none of them need answers right now. What you need is only the softness of rest, the safety of your own pillow, and the ease of drifting into dreams. So close your eyes, let the night hold you, and allow yourself to slip quietly into sleep.